In this video, we're going to build a full stack SolidJS website using SolidJS, Node.js, and Express. We'll cover navigation, local state management, global state management, file structure, SolidJS syntax. After watching this video, you should fully understand how to build and publish websites using SolidJS. And at the end of the video, I'll explain why I like SolidJS so much, specifically for building landing pages. So you'll want to make sure to watch all the way to the end of the video. Let's get started. I'll put all these links in the description below. You'll want to use this command npx digit solidjs/templates/JS if you'd like to use JavaScript, or TS if you'd like to use TypeScript, and then the name of your app. I'm going to use the TypeScript template, and I'll name it SolidJS Tutorial. And then I'll open it up in Visual Studio. It should look like this. You'll notice it's using Vite instead of Webpack or something like that. Your app is located in the source folder. This should look a bit familiar if you're used to React. The app.tsx file is where your app is located. This is what will appear on the screen. You'll notice they use CSS modules. That's because SolidJS is a single page application. Using modules allows you to scope your CSS to individual components. To see what your app looks like, you can open a terminal. The first thing you need to do is npm install. The dependencies do not come pre-installed for you, so you need to say npm install to install all of your packages. Once you've done that, you can say npm start, and then you can go to localhost 3000 to see what your app looks like. And so it looks like this. The first thing I wanted to explain is navigation. Again, I'll put this link in the description below. Solid has a router called Solid Router. We're going to be using this to set up our navigation. Your first step is to npm install the SolidJS router. After you've done that, you'll want to go to the index.tsx file that's within your source folder. It should look like this. If you come back to the documentation, what you'll need to do is import the router from solidjs/router. I'm going to put that right there. You'll also need to import something called hash integration, and you can paste that right there. This will allow navigation to work when you're using Node.js as a server. All you have to do is put a router around the app. So instead of doing it like this, I'm going to put braces around the app, and I'll go ahead and put the router around the app. And to use hash integration, you'll want to use the source prop on the router and put the hash integration function within the source. That's all we have to do in the index.tsx file. We can then go to the app.tsx file. I'm going to delete everything currently in this return statement. I'm going to put an empty tag. And so I'm going to go ahead and delete logo and styles. I'm going to import routes, route, and the letter A, capital letter A, from @solidjs/router. And then you can come back to this return statement. Within this, you can say routes. And here is where we create our routes. So the way you do that is you say route, you give it a path. Since this is the home page, I'm just going to say /. Then there's another prop called component. Within here is where you put the component. I'm going to name it home. We'll create this component in just a little bit. This is a self-closing tag. I'll make another route with a path name /users. And the component for that will be called users, which again, we'll create in a little bit. For this last page, there's a really cool feature I wanted to show you. So for the path, you can actually have two different paths in one. So say you have a login screen that can also be a sign up screen. Instead of creating two different paths, you can put curly braces, an array, and then you can have multiple paths within this array separated by commas. So for example, you can say login, comma, sign up. And for these, you don't have to put a / in front of it. And now if I go to /login or /sign up, it'll both go to the same route. And for this, instead of saying component, I'm going to say element and just return some basic HTML. I'll return an h1 tag and say this is the login /sign up screen and then self-close that. Now let's go ahead and create a basic home and users page just so we can see navigation in action. In the source folder, I'm going to create a folder called pages. I'll create a home TSX file and a users TSX file. I'll copy from the home page the component and the way to create a component. I'll rename this home, and at the bottom I'll say export default home. For now, I'll just return an H1 tag that says home page. I'll copy all of this, paste it into the users page, update the name home with users. Then I'll come back to the app.tsx file, import home from, and then I'll import users. This is one way you can import your components. If you do it this way, whenever a user goes to your website, it's going to preload all of your components. So it might slow down your website a bit. Another option is to do something called lazy load. What this will do is it will only load the components that the users go to. And so it'll speed up your website a lot. The way you can do that is you can import something called lazy from SolidJS. And instead of importing your pages like this, like you normally would, you can write it this way. Say const home equals, use this lazy function, trigger it. And within there, you just create a function and you can say import, and then you can put your link again this way. And you can do the same thing for users, and then you can comment this out. This works too. It's a better option. It makes your site faster. So if the user only goes to the home page, for example, it will not preload the users page. This will help with your Google SEO. The faster the initial load time, the better with Google. So let's go ahead and test this out and see if it works. We'll say npm start, go to localhost 3000, and there you go. It says home page. Now I'm going to try to go to users. It says users page. And lastly, to show you how this login and sign up link both works, I'm going to go to login, and then as you can see, it displays the HTML in the element prop, and then I'll say sign up, and it goes to the exact same page. The last thing with navigation that I'm going to show you is this A component. This is how you can create a link. So above routes here, I'll say nav. I'll create a nav. I'll give it a class, and the way classes work with modules is at the top, you'll want to import styles from your module.css file for each individual component. So for this one, I'm going to link to the app.module.css. And then I'm going to say styles.navigation. We're going to create a navigation style in just a little bit. I'll close that out. And the way you use these A components, you just say A and it has href. I'm going to just link to the home page for the first link. Say home. I'm going to copy these a couple times. The next one I'm going to say is sign up, and I'll link to the sign up screen. Last one, I'll say users, link to the users screen. Let's go ahead and open up the app.module.css. I'm going to put it over here in a split screen. I'm going to delete all the pre-built CSS. I'm just going to put navigation. I'll give it padding of 30 on all sides, display flex, and justify content space around. And let's see how that works. So there you go. There's a navigation now. And that's how you can create links with SolidJS. Next, I wanted to talk about local state management. We'll do that in the home screen. Let's import something called createSignal and createEffect, createStore, and createEffect from SolidJS. There's also something I want to import just to show you how it works. It's createStore from SolidJS/store. These are really similar to React hooks if you're familiar with React hooks. You can think of createSignal and createStore as use state in React. They both basically do the exact same thing as use state in React hooks. So I'll show you an example. Const, I'll just say var1 set var1 equals createSignal. I'll say 0. And then I'll do the same thing. I'll say var2. This time I'll say createStore, and I'll put an object with just with a key with an empty value. So the first thing I wanted to explain is the difference between createSignal and createStore. So just like with React hooks, the first variable is the name of the variable. The second element in the array is a function that can be used to update the value of the variable. It's the same thing with createSignal and createStore. There are a few differences between createSignal and createStore that I wanted to explain. The first is just the way you reference the variable. So if you wanted to reference a createSignal variable, say in the return statement, you can do that by saying var1, and then it's like a function that you have to trigger with braces. Whereas for createStore, you can think of it more as an object. You can just reference it directly and then say .l. You do not have to put braces. You can just reference it like this, sort of like with React hooks. So in that way, you can kind of think of createStore as more similar to useState than createSignal based on how you reference the variables. So that's the first major difference. The second difference, and really the main thing that you're probably wondering, is why are there two separate useState like functions within SolidJS? Well, based on my understanding, the createSignal is really used for one variable value. For example, if you just had like a number 0 or maybe a string like this, you would have to use createSignal because createStore won't work with a single value. So you'll notice there's a little error line under 0 when I try to change createStore to 0. Also, if I just put a string in there, it won't work. So basically, single values like a string or a number, they will not work in a store, but objects and arrays will work in a store. So that's one of the first major differences. So maybe instead of saying one variable value, you could really say it works for string and number. createStore works for object and array. But here's another thing with createSignal, it still works. So it does work with object and array as well. So I could put an object here. It won't give me any error messages. I could put an array here. It won't give me any error messages. But like we saw earlier, it does not, in the createStore, it does not work with string or number. So your next question might be, well, why don't we just always use createSignal? Why do we even have a createStore? This is getting a bit technical, and if anyone from the SolidJS team is watching this and I explained this next part wrong, please let us know in the comments below. But based on my understanding, it's really just about memory. If you update a value in createSignal, it will create a completely new object in memory. So for example, if I had an array full of objects, say I had 3 objects inside of an array, and I had just an ID in each of them. So I said ID 0, ID 1, ID 2. Now say I use the set var1 function to update the third value, or say I wanted to add another object to the end. Now say I use the set var1 and I use the spread operator in here, which we'll go over this a bit in a little bit. But this is how you can use the spread operator inside of a set function. Say I wanted to add another ID to the end. Say I wanted to add ID number 3 to the end. What's going to happen here is it's going to create in memory a completely new array with 4 new values inside of it. Or say I go in and I just update maybe I want to change this to be ID1, ID2, ID3 instead of starting at 0. Or say I wanted to go in and change the last ID to ID3. Instead of just updating this value in memory, it'll create an entirely new array and save that array to var1. With createStore, it's different though. If you go in, say you had that same object, say you had that same array full of 3 objects. If you go in and update ID number 3, change it to number 2, instead of creating a completely new array in memory and saving it, it'll just go into that one part of the memory and update this one variable here and leave the rest the same. So it sort of is a way to have your variables, your objects, your arrays be reactive as well. Sort of like when you update data on the DOM. With SolidJS, it'll update the data that changes, but it won't re-render everything. That's kind of how createStore works on the back end. It won't re-render everything. It won't recreate everything. It'll just update the one variable within the object or the array. So I'm sorry if I didn't explain that very well, but major things to remember here are createSignal is good for a string or a number. You have to use it for string and number. It will not, createStore will not work with a string or a number. So the safest thing to do if you just don't remember how all this works is you could just use createSignal for everything. You don't have to use createStore. It's not necessary, but it could make your website slightly faster if you're wanting to have the ability to update values within a store, which we're going to use this in a little bit when we create our global state management. But for now, I'll go ahead and delete that. We're just going to use createSignal for our local state management. And so I'll delete that from the import as well. So the variable I'm going to create is page name. I'm just going to give it a page name and set page name. I'll say equals createSignal, and I'll say settings at first, just because I want to also show you how to use createEffect. If you're used to React hooks again, think of createEffect as useEffect, basically the same thing. So I'm going to switch this text to be this is the, and I'll say page name. And remember, you have to trigger it like it's a function to return the value settings. And then I'll say page. And if you come back to the home screen, it currently says this is the settings page, but I wanted to say this is the home page. So to do that, I'm going to use createEffect. You can just put a function within here. I'm going to say set page name. I'm going to update it to home. And so now it should say home if I refresh. And there you go. It changed to this is the home page. Now, if you're used to useEffect, you may be used to something where you can put an empty array at the end, make it look something like this. I'll just type it out real fast. You could put a comma here with an empty array, and that will make sure that useEffect only triggers a single time, one time. It won't trigger multiple times. Well, SolidJS kind of has the same thing too, but it's just a completely different function. Instead of using createEffect, it's called onMount. It works exactly the same way as createEffect. The only difference is onMount, you know for sure it will only trigger one time. So it won't re-trigger every time something changes in the DOM. It will only trigger one time. But I'm okay with createEffect for now. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. That covers local state management. Next, I wanted to talk about global state management. We can use the createStore effect. To create our global state, you can go to source, create a file, just call it store.ts. Within here, I'm going to import that createStore that we were talking about earlier. We're going to use that when creating our global state. I'll say from SolidJS/store. I'm going to say interface app store. This again is where we're going to be storing all of our global state. And I'm just going to create something called users string array. And for the export default, I'll say export default. I'll use this function here, createStore. So we're going to be exporting this createStore function. And here I'll say app store. I'll put braces, curly braces, and within here, I'll just say users again with an empty string. And so now by putting this in the root of our project, it can be accessible from any component. So I'm going to go back to the app component. Right here, I'll go ahead and import store from the store that we just created. And down here in my app component, at the top, I'm going to say const store set store equals store. And remember, all this store is, it's a create store function that is now accessible globally, just like a React hook that's accessible globally. Another thing I'm going to use for my global state management, there's something built into JavaScript called local storage. And you can just say const local storage from window. This deconstructs local storage from the window object in the browser. Local storage stays persistent. So anything you save to local storage, even if the user leaves your website and comes back, it'll still be saved in local storage. Or say they refresh the page, it'll still be there. So it's very useful in apps where users log in and things like that. You can save their user information to the local storage so that they can automatically be logged in every time they revisit your website. In the app screen, I'm going to go ahead and use the onMount function I was telling you about. So I'll import that up here. And again, this is like use effect, but it will only trigger one time. Down here under store, I'm going to create my onMount function. What I'm going to do is I'm going to check if the value of users is empty. If it is, then I'm going to add some user values to it. And we're eventually going to show those names on the user's screen. So I'll say if store.users.length is equal to 0, which means there's no users in the users array in global state, then I first want to save the users to local storage. I'll say const users. And the thing to know about local state is everything has to be a string if you save it to local state. So you can't just save an array full of data to local state. It won't work. So you first have to stringify something like an array. If it's not already a string, you have to stringify the JSON object before you can save it to local storage. So I'm going to go ahead and say JSON stringify, and this is just built into JavaScript. Within here, I'm going to create an array full of usernames. I'm just going to say user1, user2, user3, and then I'll go ahead and save this to local storage. The way you do that is you say local storage dot set item, and you can think of local storage as a collection of objects. This first value is the key name. So I'm going to say users, and then the second value is the value of the object key. So I'm going to say for the user key, I want the value to be this user's stringified array. So that's the first thing I want to do to make sure that all of this will be persistent. Even if the user refreshes the page, I can still have access to this data using local storage. The second thing I'm going to do is save to the store, to the global state, so that I can access this in other screens. The first thing I'll do is I'll get the users, and I'll say users stringified, because if you get it from local storage, it's going to be a string. So I'll say local storage. There's something called get item. This allows you to get a value. I'm going to get the value of the key users that's been saved to local storage. And the first thing I'm going to check is make sure that it's not null. So if I were to say something like users-1 or something like that, if something is not in local storage, it's going to return null. So I just want to make sure there's actually a value for users stringified. I'll say exclamation equals null. So as long as it's not null, the next thing I want to do is set the store. This first option is the key name again. So in the store, the key name is users, and then I'll put a comma. And this next part is the value I want to assign to the user. I don't want it to be a string, so I'm going to JSON parse it so that it becomes an array again. I'll say users stringified. And now the value that has been saved to the store is an array, this original array. And now this is accessible anywhere within the app. So I'm going to go to users. I'm going to import the store from, I have to go up a level So store, and I'll go ahead and import a couple more things. I'll import styles from, I'll just go ahead and import the same app.modules CSS file. And then there's a couple more things I want to import from SolidJS. There's something called for. This is like a mapping function. I'll show you how it works in just a little bit. We can use this to loop through data and return values based on each element within an array. The next thing I'm going to import is onMount again, and this is from SolidJS. I'm gonna go ahead again. I'll create what looks like a hook, say store set store equals store. And then I'm going to create an onMount function. And I'm going to use onMount just to make sure that this will only trigger one time. I'm going to check to make sure the store.users.length is greater. For this one, I'm going to check if the store.users.length is less than 4, because I'm going to add an additional element to it. I'm going to do this just so you can see how the spread operator works. So on our app screen, we just created 3 users, but say we wanted a 4th one. I'm going to say set store. I'm going to be updating the user's value. And to use the spread operator, you can put an array, say ... store.users. So what this is saying is take the values that are currently saved in the store array, put that at the front of the array, put comma, and then right after that, add this string to the end of the array. And so now this should also show up down here in the return statement once we render the values of store using the for function. Let's go ahead and come down here to return. We'll do that. We'll put braces. I'm going to create a div with a class, and for styles, I'll say padding. We'll create these in just a second. At the top, I'm going to say list of users. We'll go ahead and use this for function. The way it works is you say for each equals, and then within the curly braces, you put the data you want to loop through. So I'm going to say store.users so that it will loop through the array of users. And then within this for component, you can put curly braces again. I'm going to name the first value user. This is the name that you're assigning to the element. So since it's a single user within an array full of users, I'm going to name it user. The second value is index. I'm just going to say I for index. Make this an arrow function. I'll just create a p tag and I'll give this a class name of padding left. We're going to add some padding to the left of it. And we're going to use the index to create sort of a list. We're going to create our own ordered list using the index. So just put curly braces. You can say I, and you have to put braces after it. So it's like a function that you're triggering, and that will return the number, the index. And since it starts at index 0, I'm going to say +1 so that the first number is 1, semicolon. And here we'll put some more curly braces and I'll just say user. And so then it'll return the value of the user, the string within the user's array. Let's come back to our app.module.css. We'll create padding, just say padding 30 pixels, and then padding left. I'll create padding left 30 pixels. All right, and this should all be working. Let's go back and try it out. So I'll go to the home, the sign up screen is working. And there, as you can see, the users is working as well. And it did add user 4 to the end of the value. All right, so that finishes the front end. I'm going to create a really quick back end so you can know how to reference everything using Node.js. So in the root of the project, I'm going to create a server folder. And here I'll say index.js. And I put a link to this code in the description below. You can go to that link to see how I created this basic server. The big thing to remember before creating the server is you'll need to say npm run build. This will create a dist folder. Whenever you're referencing your SolidJS project in a server, you're going to want to reference this dist folder that's created when you say npm run build. And so that's what I've done here. And so now if I say node server index, if I turn on the server, it says it's listening on 4040. I can go to localhost 4040, and there it is. So that is how to build a full stack application using SolidJS, Node.js, and Express. What I love about SolidJS is that it is so fast. It allows you to build a website in a way that feels like React, but it's actually fast. React.js is really slow, so it's terrible for Google search engine optimization. I have found in the past what I end up having to do is just create a separate landing page using traditional HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript so that it can be the fastest it could possibly be, so that it'll show up well on Google. And then I would create a separate app at app.whatever.com using React once the user is logged in, because then the speed doesn't matter. But I love with SolidJS, I can create my landing pages in a way that's familiar to me, that feels like React, and it'll still be really fast. So I'm personally planning on using SolidJS for all of my landing pages. If you work somewhere and maybe your manager is kind of hesitant to using SolidJS, that's also a great way to get them used to it. Try to get them to let you use it for landing pages so that it shows up better on Google. Please share this video on social media to help out anyone interested in SolidJS. I noticed there's not very many in-depth tutorials out there. I tried to make this video be the most comprehensive guide for beginners. Like the video if you'd like to see more videos like this. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.